More than 300 million years ago, long before the first dinosaurs walked the Earth, the planet was covered by a world that would feel almost unrecognizable to us today. If someone could stand on the surface during that distant age, the landscape would not resemble the forests we know. It would appear larger, heavier with moisture, and strangely alive with forms that seem almost mythical when imagined through modern eyes. Across vast regions of the ancient continents, enormous swamp forests stretched farther than any rainforest today. These were the Carboniferous forests, and they formed one of the most extensive ecosystems the planet had ever seen. Towering plants rose toward the sky like pillars in a cathedral of green. Many of these trees were not true trees in the modern sense, but giant relatives of mosses known as clummuses. Their trunks grew tall and straight, often reaching heights comparable to modern buildings. From their tops spread crowns of narrow leaves that caught the warm sunlight filtering through the humid atmosphere. Beneath them, giant ferns unfolded broad fronds that stretched outward in layered waves of deep green. The forest floor remained dim and quiet, covered by thick vegetation that thrived in the constant warmth and moisture. The air itself felt different in this world. Heavy with humidity, it carried a soft mist that drifted slowly through the trunks. Water pooled in shallow wetlands and winding channels, forming a vast network of swamps that connected forest to forest across entire continents. Movement was constant, though rarely loud. Amphibians slipped quietly through the warm water, their long bodies gliding between submerged roots. These creatures ruled the wetlands, thriving in the endless pools and marshes that filled the lowlands. Across the damp ground, enormous arthropods crawled through fallen leaves and thick undergrowth. Some resembled millipedes but grew to lengths that would seem astonishing today, their armored bodies moving slowly across the forest floor. Above it all, the air belonged to the giants of the sky. Dragonflies with wingspans, wider than many modern birds, drifted through the humid air. Their delicate wings shimmered as they moved between the towering plants, gliding through a world that seemed built perfectly for them. The forests themselves appeared unstoppable. Everywhere life expanded. Plants grew densely in every available space. Wetlands stretched outward year after year. The environment seemed balanced, stable, and endlessly productive. For millions of years, these forests dominated the planet. They spread across regions that would one day become North America and Europe, forming an immense belt of vegetation circling the equator of the ancient Earth. If someone had lived during that time, it might have seemed impossible to imagine the forests ever disappearing. Yet nature rarely reveals its turning points immediately. Even the most powerful ecosystems depend on delicate relationships, subtle balances between climate, atmosphere, and life itself. From within the endless green canopy, the forests felt eternal, but far beyond the reach of those towering plants. Forces were already beginning to move. Continents drifted slowly across the surface of the planet. Mountains rose and redirected winds. Invisible shifts in the atmosphere began altering the patterns of rain that had once fed these wetlands. At first, the forests did not notice. They continued to grow. Their roots sunk deep into warm swamp soils, their leaves drinking in sunlight and moisture. But hidden beneath their strength was a quiet vulnerability. And if someone had been able to see the future from that ancient forest floor, they might have asked a question that still echoes through the study of Earth's past. What if one of the largest forests the planet had ever known could vanish almost entirely? To understand how such an enormous world could disappear, we first have to look beyond the forest itself and into the invisible forces that shape the air above it. To understand the strange forests of the Carboniferous world, it helps to look not only at the plants and animals living within them, but at something far less visible. The true architect of that ancient ecosystem was not a creature moving through the swamps or a towering tree reaching into the humid sky. It was the air itself. During this distant chapter of Earth's history, the atmosphere was quietly transforming. The immense forests spreading across the continents were doing more than growing. They were altering the chemistry of the planet in ways that would shape life for millions of years. Every leaf in those forests absorbed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through the slow process of photosynthesis. Sunlight, water, and carbon were woven together inside the tissues of the plants, building trunks, leaves, and roots that filled the endless wetlands. When those plants died, their remains did not always decay the way modern forests do. The ground beneath the Carboniferous forests was saturated with water. Thick layers of mud and stagnant pools created environments where oxygen was scarce beneath the surface. Fallen plants often sank into these dark wetlands, where decomposition slowed to a crawl. Instead of breaking down completely and returning their carbon to the atmosphere, Enormous quantities of plant material accumulated. Layer after layer of organic debris settled into the swamps. Over time, sediments buried these layers deeper and deeper beneath the Earth's surface. Pressure increased. Heat slowly altered the structure of the ancient plants. Across millions of years, the remains of entire forests transformed into coal. These buried deposits would remain hidden underground for an almost unimaginable span of time before humans eventually discovered them. But long before that future arrived, the forests had already changed something far more immediate. By locking carbon underground, they allowed oxygen to build in the atmosphere above. Slowly, almost invisibly, oxygen levels climbed higher and higher. Today, the air around us contains about 21% oxygen. But during the Carboniferous period, many scientists believe the concentration rose to levels between 30 and 35%. The world was breathing richer air. This subtle difference had extraordinary consequences for life. Insects, unlike mammals or birds, do not rely on lungs to move oxygen through their bodies. Instead, they breathe through small openings along their sides connected to tubes that deliver oxygen directly to their tissues. When the atmosphere contains more oxygen, that system becomes far more efficient. Suddenly, the size limits that normally constrain insects begin to loosen. And in the forests of the Carboniferous world, insects grew to proportions that seem almost unbelievable today. Dragonflies with wingspans wider than hawks drifted through the humid skies. Their long bodies cut silently through the mist above the forest canopy. These ancient predators ruled the air long before birds would ever appear. On the ground, enormous arthropods crept through the vegetation. Some resembled modern millipedes, but stretched for lengths that could rival a bicycle. Their segmented bodies moved slowly through fallen leaves, thriving in the warm oxygen, rich air of the swamp forests. The world itself seemed larger. The forests grew thicker. The creatures grew bigger. Life expanded into spaces that might not have been possible under the conditions we experience today. And yet, hidden within this extraordinary abundance was a quiet vulnerability. The forests were not merely landscapes filled with life. They were engines transforming the atmosphere of an entire planet. Every tree, every fern, every layer of buried plant material helped maintain the delicate chemical balance that allowed this world to exist. As long as the forests continued growing, oxygen would remain high. Carbon would remain locked underground. The ecosystem would continue flourishing. But the balance was fragile. The same forces that had allowed these forests to dominate the planet could also begin to unravel them. Far beyond the wetlands, the continents were slowly drifting. Mountains were rising. Winds and rainfall patterns were beginning to change in ways no living creature could sense. For now, the forests remained vast and thriving. But beneath the surface of the Earth, the planet itself was preparing the next chapter of the story. If someone had walked through the Carboniferous forests during their height, nothing about the landscape would have suggested that change was coming. The wetlands stretched endlessly in every direction. The air remained thick with warmth and moisture. Amphibians slid through quiet pools while giant insects drifted slowly above the canopy. The forests appeared timeless. Day after day, the same rhythms unfolded. Sunlight filtered through layers of enormous plants. Water moved gently through shallow channels. Life continued expanding across the swamps as it had for millions of years. From within the forest, the world seemed stable. But beyond the view of the towering plants, the continents themselves were moving. The process was slow, so slow that no creature living within those forests could possibly sense it. Across millions of years, enormous landmasses were drifting. The early shape of a supercontinent was forming. Today we call it Pangea. As these vast pieces of the Earth's crust moved closer together, they changed more than geography. Mountains began rising where continents collided. Coastlines shifted. Oceans narrowed. And with those changes came a quiet transformation in the way air moved around the planet. Winds followed new paths. Storm systems altered their courses. The patterns that carried rain across the equatorial regions slowly began to shift. At first, the forests felt little difference. Rain still fell across the swamps. The wetlands remained saturated with water. The ancient plants continued growing as they always had. But the Carboniferous forests depended on more than just occasional rain. They required constant moisture. Many of the giant plants anchoring those ecosystems possessed shallow root systems, suited perfectly for swamp environments. Their roots spread outward through soft, waterlogged soils that rarely dried. As long as the ground remained saturated, the forests thrived. Yet, when rainfall patterns change, even slightly, those shallow foundations become vulnerable. In some regions, dry seasons began lasting just a little longer. Water levels dropped for brief periods before returning again. For a time, the forests endured these changes, but small shifts in climate often begin quietly, long before their consequences become visible. And while the planet itself was adjusting to new atmospheric patterns, another transformation was unfolding among the animals living beneath the canopy. A subtle evolutionary innovation had begun appearing among certain small creatures moving through the forest floor. These were the earliest reptiles. Unlike amphibians whose eggs required water to survive, reptiles possessed something new, eggs protected by specialized membranes that prevented them from drying out. These eggs could develop on land, far from ponds or wetlands. It was a small difference in biology, but that difference changed everything. Amphibians remained tied to water for reproduction. Reptiles were not. In environments where moisture fluctuated, reptiles held a quiet advantage. At first, this advantage mattered little. The forests were still vast. Wetlands still covered immense areas. Amphibians remained the dominant animals of the Carboniferous world. Yet evolution rarely moves in straight lines. It prepares possibilities long before they become necessary. Within the endless green forests, amphibians continued thriving, unaware that another group of creatures was slowly learning how to live beyond the swamps. The forests themselves still appeared eternal, but the deeper systems supporting them, the climate, the atmosphere, and the shifting continents beneath the oceans, were beginning to change. Nothing had collapsed yet. No dramatic catastrophe had arrived, but somewhere within the balance of rain, soil, and atmosphere, the first cracks had begun to form. And in the next chapter of this ancient story, those small cracks would begin spreading through the greatest forests the planet had ever known. For millions of years, the forests of the Carboniferous world lived under a simple and reliable rhythm. Warm air rose above endless wetlands, clouds gathered in heavy layers across the sky, and rain fell again and again across the swamps below. The ground rarely dried. Water filled the lowlands, winding slowly between towering plants, whose roots spread through permanently soaked soil. Everything about these forests depended on that constant moisture. The giant clumbuses, the vast ferns, the thick vegetation carpeting the forest floor. All of it had evolved in a world where water never seemed to disappear. The wetlands fed the forests, and the forests shaped the wetlands in return. From within the canopy, the system appeared unbreakable. But the climate of a planet is never fixed forever. Far beyond the quiet swamps, the continents were still drifting toward one another. The growing mass of land that would become the supercontinent Pangaea continued assembling piece by piece. As the landmasses shifted, mountain ranges rose where plates collided, lifting new barriers into the atmosphere. Those mountains did something subtle but powerful. They began redirecting the winds. Air currents that had once traveled freely across oceans and lowlands were forced to follow new paths. Storm systems moved differently. The routes that carried moisture across the equatorial forests began slowly changing. At first, the forests barely noticed. Rain still arrived. The swamps still held water. Amphibians continued gliding through the wetlands while insects drifted above the trees. Life seemed as abundant as ever. Yet something small had begun to change. The rain did not come quite as often. Where clouds had once gathered continuously, they now formed in cycles. Periods of clear sky began lasting a little longer before the next storms arrived. The ground, which had remained permanently saturated for millions of years, occasionally began to dry at the surface. These moments of dryness were brief at first. The next rainfall would return and the wetlands would fill again. But the pattern had shifted. Slowly, across thousands of years, those dry periods lengthened. Swamps that had once stretched across enormous regions began shrinking slightly around their edges. The deepest wetlands remained stable, but the outer margins of the forest started changing. In some places, the soil dried enough to expose ground that had once been submerged beneath shallow water. Plants that depended on saturated soils struggled in these areas. Their roots, designed for wet environments, were poorly suited to withstand prolonged dryness. Some of the towering swamp plants began disappearing from those outer regions. The forest did not collapse all at once. Instead, it slowly began retreating. Where endless vegetation had once formed a continuous belt across the continents, the landscape started breaking into separate regions. Forests still thrived near rivers, lakes, and deep wetlands where water remained reliable. But between these areas, something unfamiliar began appearing. Treeland. Open spaces slowly expanded between the forests. What had once been a single, enormous ecosystem stretching across vast distances now began dividing into smaller patches, separated by drier terrain. For the plants and animals living within those forests, this change was profound. Species that had once moved freely across thousands of kilometers of continuous wetlands suddenly found themselves confined to shrinking habitats. Populations became isolated from one another, as the forests fragmented into distant pockets. And yet, from the ground, the transformation was difficult to see. There was no sudden disaster, no firestorm, no catastrophic explosion of destruction. The forests simply stopped spreading. Their edges retreated year after year, quietly giving way to landscapes that were becoming less humid and more seasonal. What had once seemed like the most stable ecosystem on Earth was slowly unraveling, and as the forests began breaking apart, the creatures that depended on them faced a new and unfamiliar challenge. A world that had always been wet was beginning to dry. For millions of years, the quiet rulers of the Carboniferous forests were not reptiles or mammals, and certainly not birds. The wetlands belonged to amphibians. They thrived in the endless swamps that covered the ancient continents. Their bodies were built for that humid world. Smooth skin allowed them to breathe through moisture. Their eggs, delicate and unprotected, needed water to survive. Life for these animals began in shallow pools, where gelatinous clusters of eggs floated among submerged plants before hatching into aquatic young. Only later did they crawl onto land. As long as the wetlands stretched across the landscape, this cycle worked perfectly. Water was everywhere. Rivers moved slowly through dense vegetation. Pools formed in every depression of the swampy ground. The forests gave amphibians everything they needed. Some species grew surprisingly large. Long-bodied predators lurked in murky pools, waiting for smaller animals to wander too close. Others slipped quietly through shallow water, feeding on insects and smaller creatures that shared the wetlands. For ages beyond human comprehension, amphibians flourished. But the stability of their world depended on a single, fragile condition: the presence of water. When the rains began changing and wetlands slowly shrank, the consequences for amphibians were immediate. At first, the changes were subtle. Pools dried a little sooner than before. Marshy ground hardened for brief periods under the sun. Shallow channels that once carried water year-round began shrinking into seasonal streams. For creatures whose entire life cycle required moisture, even small shifts in water availability became dangerous. Eggs left in drying pools could perish before they hatched. Young amphibians that needed water for development suddenly faced habitats that disappeared too quickly. As the forests fragmented, amphibian populations became trapped within isolated wetlands. The continuous corridors of swamp that once allowed them to move freely across vast distances no longer existed. Instead, each surviving patch of forest became a kind of island. Within those islands, amphibians continued their ancient rhythms, laying eggs in the remaining pools and marshes. But beyond the edges of those wetlands, stretched landscapes growing steadily drier. Habitats became risky or impossible. Isolated populations began. Some species entirely from regions where weeperlands disappear. Others are covered only in the deeper swamps where water remained. While amphibians struggled to adapt to the changing world, another group of animals was quietly expanding. These creatures had once lived alongside amphibians in the shadows of the forest floor. They were smaller, less dominant, and often overlooked within the crowded ecosystems of the Carboniferous wetlands. Yet they carried within their biology a remarkable innovation. These were the earliest reptiles. Unlike amphibians, reptiles did not rely on water to reproduce. They were in protective membranes that shielded developing embryos from drying out. Inside these structures, young reptiles could grow safely on land without needing a surrounding pool of water. This simple evolutionary change allowed reptiles to do something amphibians could not. They could leave the wetlands. As dry regions expanded between the shrinking forests, reptiles moved into those spaces. They explored riverbanks that dried during part of the year. They crossed open terrain that amphibians could not survive. Gradually, these early reptiles began occupying environments that were becoming increasingly common as the climate shifted. The transformation was slow. Amphibians did not disappear overnight. Many species continued thriving in the wetlands that remained. But the balance of the ecosystem had begun to shift. Where amphibians once dominated nearly every corner of the forested swamps, reptiles were now appearing in places that had previously been empty. The collapse of the rainforest had quietly changed the rules of survival. In a wetter world, amphibians held the advantage. In a drier one, reptiles began to thrive. What seemed like a gradual environmental change was becoming something far more significant. It was an evolutionary turning point. From this moment forward, reptiles would continue spreading across the planet. eventually giving rise to creatures that would dominate the Earth for hundreds of millions of years. But amphibians were not the only giants shaped by the Carboniferous forests. Above the wetlands, and across the forest floor, lived another group of creatures whose existence depended on the same humid world. And as the fate would soon begin to change as well, in the strange forests of the Carboniferous world, some of the most extra creatures ever to live on ruled the air and the shadows beneath. But trees, they were not reptile trees. They were insects and arthropods. Yet they grew to sizes that seem almost unbelievable today. Above the towering plants rifted through the humid sky, their wings stretched wider than many modern birds, glimmering as they glided through layers of warm mist. These ancient hunters moved with quiet precision, patrolling the canopy for smaller insects moving through the thick air. On the forest floor, other giants moved slowly through the dense vegetation. Some resembled millipedes, their long segmented bodies protected by armored shells. One species known today through fossils stretched more than 2 meters in length. As it crawled through fallen leaves and damp soil, its many legs carried it steadily through a world built perfectly for creatures of such size. Predatory arthropods also prowled the wetlands. With sharp limbs and keen senses, they hunted smaller animals among the roots and pools of the swamp forests. In the Carboniferous world, insects were not small background creatures. They were giants. The secret to their size was hidden in the air itself. The atmosphere of that era held far more oxygen than the world we breathe today. For insects, which rely on a network of tiny tubes to carry oxygen directly into their bodies, this richer air allowed their tissues to receive far more oxygen than modern insects can access. With such abundance available, their bodies could grow larger without suffocating under their own weight. The forests and the atmosphere worked together to create this unusual world. As plants absorbed carbon dioxide and buried their remains in swamp sediments, oxygen levels continued rising. The result was a planet whose air supported creatures that seem almost mythical from a modern perspective. But when the forest began declining, the atmosphere slowly changed with them. As the great swamp forests fragmented and retreated, less plant material was buried beneath the wetlands. The vast carbon storage engine that had once removed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere began slowing. Over long stretches of time, oxygen levels gradually fell. The change was not dramatic. No creature would have noticed it in a single generation. Yet for insects whose bodies depended in passive oxygen diffusion, even a small shift in atmospheric composition created limits that could not easily be overcome. Large bodies require enormous amounts of oxygen. As the atmosphere changed, those limits began tightening. Creatures that once thrived in oxygen-rich air could no longer grow to the same immense sizes. At the same time, their habitats were shrinking. The forests that had supported them were breaking into scattered patches, separated by expanding dry terrain. Wetlands vanished. Dense vegetation retreated. For many of the giant arthropods, the world they depended on was slowly disappearing. Over time, the great dragonflies faded from the skies. The massive millets fanned the forest floor. The enormous arthropods that once roamed the swamp disappeared from the fossility record. The fossil record. What remained were smaller descendants, creatures that still filled the air and soil, but no longer dominated their environment with the same astonishing scale. The world itself was changing. The humid, alien landscape of the Carboniferous period was slowly giving way to something more familiar. A planet of shifting climates, expanding dry regions and ecosystems that resembled the foundations of modern environments. And within this transformation lay an extraordinary consequence. The collapse of those ancient forests did not simply remove strange creatures from the earth. It reshaped the conditions that determined which forms of life could thrive. In the new world that followed, reptiles continued spreading across the changing landscapes. Their descendants would eventually give rise to dinosaurs, birds, and mammals. Without the quiet disappearance of those forests, the evolutionary path that led to our own existence might never have unfolded. A vanished rainforest hundreds of millions of years in the past may have changed the entire direction of life on Earth. Yet for such an important turning point, the Carboniferous rainforest collapse remains surprisingly unknown. The question that follows is almost as mysterious as the forests themselves. If this ancient transformation shaped the future of life on Earth, how did scientists discover that it ever happened at all? The collapse of the Carboniferous rainforest did not arrive like a thunderclap. There was no single day when the forests fell silent, no sudden catastrophe that erased them from the Earth. Instead, the transformation unfolded with the patience of geological time, spreading quietly across millions of years. From within the swamps, life continued as it always had. Amphibians still glided through shallow waters. Giant insects still moved through humid air. The towering plants still reached skyward through layers of mist. Yet across the broader landscape, something subtle had begun to happen. The endless belt of rainforest that once wrapped around the equator was slowly breaking apart. A once eruption across vast distances. Small changes in climate were beginning to reshape the terrain. Rainfall patterns shifted as continents moved and mountains altered the pathways of storms. Regions received rain than before. In others, dry seasons became longer and more pronounced. The difference was gradual, but over time it became impossible for the ancient forests to ignore. Wetlands began shrinking. Shallow swamps that once held water throughout the year started drying during certain seasons. The great plants that depended on permanently soaked soils struggled in these changing conditions. Along the outer edges of the rainforest, vegetation began thinning. At first the forest simply retreated toward rivers and deeper wetlands where water remained dependable. These areas continued thriving, dense with towering plants and tangled vegetation. But between those surviving regions, unfamiliar landscapes began appearing. Dry plains slowly expanded where swamp forests had once grown. Streams that once wandered lazily through wetlands became more defined rivers flowing between open ground. The world that had once been dominated by endless swamp forests began transforming into something far more varied. Instead of one enormous ecosystem, the landscape became a patchwork. Forests remained in some places. Open terrain spread in others. Wetlands persisted in sheltered basins where rainfall remained strong. What had once been continuous was now fragmented. Scientists studying the rocks of that era have discovered this transformation, written in the layers beneath our feet. In older deposits, fossilized plant remains reveal forests that appear almost uniform across enormous regions. The same types of vegetation appear again and again, suggesting that vast wetlands once connected these areas without interruption. But in younger layers, the story changes. Plant fossils begin showing a different pattern. Instead of a single continuous ecosystem, distinct communities appear in separate regions. Some areas remain wet and forested, while others show evidence of drier plants adapted to more seasonal conditions. The forests had fractured, and with that fragmentation came consequences that reached far beyond the plants themselves. Animals that once moved freely through thousands of kilometers of continuous rainforest suddenly found their world divided. Populations became trapped inside shrinking habitats, separated from others of their kind by expanding stretches of dry terrain. Creatures that had once shared the same ecosystem were now isolated in distant pockets of forest. Isolation has powerful effects on life. When populations become separated, their evolutionary paths begin diverging. Small differences accumulate over time as species adapt to the unique conditions of their local environments. The once unified rainforest ecosystem became something entirely different. It had turned into a collection of ecological islands, scattered across the landscape. Each island followed its own path. Each developed its own balance of species and conditions. Each became a quiet laboratory of evolution, unfolding in isolation. From above, the transformation might have looked almost peaceful. Patches of green forest surrounded by open land, wetlands shimmering between stretches of dry terrain. But beneath that calm appearance, the ancient world was changing in ways that would reshape the future of life on Earth. And as the forest continued fragmenting, the plants and animals living within them faced an increasingly difficult challenge. The world was becoming drier, and survival, in that changing landscape, would require new strategies that the ancient swamp forests had never needed before. Once the endless rainforest fractured into scattered pockets of green, the world entered a quiet new phase of its story. The forests still existed, but they no longer formed one vast connected ecosystem. Instead, they were separated by widening stretches of dry land, rivers, and open plains. Each remaining forest stood alone, like an island surrounded not by water, but by unfamiliar terrain. Inside the pockets, life continued. Amphibians still slipped through the pools and marshes where water remained. Their ancient rhythms endured within these refuges. Eggs floated in the shallows. Young emerged from the water before crawling on soil, beneath terrain plants. But their world had grown smaller. Where amphibians freely through endless wetlands, they now lived within shrinking habitats, surrounded by landscapes that could not sustain them. For fiat creatures so deeply tied to Pifika, Greycross and dry ground was dangerous. Some populations survived within these isolated swamps, adapting as best they could to the changing conditions. Others gradually disappeared as their pools vanished. or their habitats grew too small to support them. The forests had become sanctuaries for species that depended on the old world. Beyond those sanctuaries, another story was unfolding. Reptiles, once minor inhabitants of the forest floor, began spreading across the newly forming dry environments. Their eggs, protected by membranes that prevented them from drying out, allowed them to reproduce far from standing water. What had once been a small advantage was becoming increasingly powerful. As dry terrain expanded between forest islands, reptiles could move across landscapes that amphibians could not survive. They crossed riverbanks that periodically dried. They ventured into open plains where the ground hardened beneath the sun. Little by little, reptiles began occupying territories that had previously been empty. The transformation was not sudden, but it was relentless. Plants were changing as well. The towering swamp plants that had once dominated the Carboniferous forests depended on saturated soil and constant humidity. When rainfall patterns shifted and wetlands shrank, many of these ancient species struggled to survive. In their place, new types of plants began appearing. Some of these plants reproduced through seeds rather than spores. Unlike spores, which often required damp environments to develop, seeds carried their own protective coverings and stored nutrients. They could survive dry conditions and wait patiently for the right moment to grow. This adaptation gave seed plants a remarkable advantage in a world where moisture was no longer guaranteed. Across the fragmented landscape, these plants began spreading into areas that older swamp species could no longer occupy. They grew along riverbanks that dried seasonally and across open terrain where rainfall arrived in cycles rather than constant streams. The forests themselves slowly transformed. Instead of towering swamps filled with ancient lycopods and giant ferns, new plant communities began emerging. These plants were better suited to the shifting climate and the increasingly seasonal rhythms of rainfall. The appearance of the landscape changed with them. Where dense wetlands had once dominated the horizon, more varied ecosystems began forming. Patches of forest mixed with open terrain, river valleys, and dry plains. Each forest island followed its own evolutionary path. In one region, amphibians might persist longer in deep wetlands. In another, reptiles might become the dominant animals along drying riverbanks. Plant communities varied from place to place depending on local rainfall and soil conditions. Isolation began shaping life in powerful ways. When populations remain separated for long periods, small differences accumulate. Creatures adapt to the specific challenges of their environments. Over generations, those differences grow more pronounced until entirely new species emerge. The fragmented rainforest had become a network of evolutionary laboratories. In each isolated habitat, life was experimenting with new forms, new strategies, and new ways of surviving in a changing world. What once appeared as a decline in biodiversity was actually a transformation. The ancient Carboniferous ecosystem was dissolving, but from its fragments new evolutionary pathways were beginning to emerge. And those pathways would soon reshape the structure of life across the planet. Because the rainforest collapse was not only altering individual species, it was beginning to change the entire architecture of Earth's ecosystems, setting the stage for a world that would look very different from the humid forests that came before. As the great rainforests of the Carboniferous world began fragmenting and retreating, the consequences extended far beyond the boundaries of the forests themselves. What had started as a slow ecological shift was becoming something larger, something planetary in scale. For millions of years, those forests had shaped the atmosphere of Earth in quiet, but powerful ways. Every towering plant absorbed carbon dioxide from the air. Every fallen trunk sinking into the wetlands locked that carbon underground. The forests acted as vast biological engines, pulling carbon from the sky and storing it beneath layers of mud and sediment. In doing so, they had gradually increased the oxygen content of the atmosphere, creating the unusual conditions that allowed giant insects and dense ecosystems to flourish. But as the forests declined, that balance began changing. The endless wetlands that once buried enormous quantities of plant material were shrinking. With fewer forests growing and fewer plants becoming trapped in swamp sediments, the steady removal of carbon dioxide slowed. Over long stretches of time, the atmosphere began adjusting. Oxygen levels gradually fell from their extraordinary Carboniferous peaks. The change was slow, unfolding across millions of years, yet its effects spread through every layer of the planet's living systems. Creatures that depended on oxygen, rich air faced new limitations. Ecosystems that once thrived under stable conditions found themselves adapting to a different atmospheric balance. At the same time, the geography of the Earth continued evolving. As the supercontinent Pangaea assembled, vast landmasses joined together to form enormous continental interiors. These regions lay far from the moderating influence of the oceans. Without constant moisture carried from the sea, climates in these areas became more extreme. Rainfall patterns shifted again. Some regions grew drier than they had ever been during the height of the rainforest era. Seasons became more pronounced. Periods of heavy rain alternated with longer intervals of dryness. The swamp landscapes that had once dominated the equatorial world began fading from the map. In their place appeared new environments, broad plains, seasonal river valleys, and open terrain where vegetation adapted to cycles of rain and drought. The ancient world of endless wetlands was dissolving. Where dense swamp forests once stretched across continents, the Earth was developing a far more varied and unpredictable landscape. This transformation also altered the planet's carbon cycle. For millions of years, Carboniferous forests had locked enormous amounts of carbon underground, slowly building the coal deposits that still lie beneath the surface today. As the forests declined, the rate at which carbon became buried began changing. The Earth entered a new balance between atmosphere, vegetation, and climate. Plants evolved new strategies for survival. Animals adapted to shifting habitats. Ecosystems reorganized themselves around the rhythms of a world no longer dominated by permanent wetlands. The transformation was profound. If someone could have watched those millions of years, they would have seen the green belt of Carboniferous rainforest gradually fragmenting, thinning, and eventually giving way to landscapes that looked increasingly unfamiliar. The humid, alien world of giant insects and endless swamps slowly faded. In its place emerged an Earth shaped by seasonal climates, open environments, and ecosystems that more closely resembled those we recognize today. Yet the story of the rainforest collapse is not simply about loss. It is also about preparation. Because with the disappearance of the old forests, the stage was quietly being set for entirely new forms of life to rise. Reptiles were expanding across the changing landscapes. New plant communities were spreading across the continents. The world that followed would belong to different creatures and different ecosystems. But for scientists studying this ancient transformation today, another mystery remained. How could such an enormous ecological shift remain hidden for so long? Rainforest once stretched across much of the planet and then nearly vanished. The question naturally follows, where did the evidence go? The answer lies buried deep within the rocks beneath our feet, waiting to be uncoved by those who know how to read the planet's ancient record. For most of human history, the disappearance of the Carboniferous rainforests remained completely unknown. No ruins marked their existence. No ancient writings described their fall. The forests had vanished hundreds of millions of years before the first humans ever appeared, leaving behind only faint traces buried deep within the Earth. Those traces waited quietly beneath layers of rock. The story of how scientists eventually discovered this lost world is not one of sudden revelation, but of patient observation. It began with something ordinary: coal. For centuries, coal had been mined across parts of Europe and North America as a source of fuel. Workers digging deep underground often encountered dark seams of compressed plant material, sandwiched between layers of stone. At first, these deposits were simply valued for the energy they provided. But scientists studying the rocks surrounding those coal seams began noticing something unusual. Within certain layers of sediment, the remains of ancient plants appeared in astonishing abundance. Fossilized trunks, leaves, and spores revealed forests that once covered vast regions of the planet. Many of these plants were unlike anything growing today. There were the giant lycopods, towering relatives of modern clumsies, whose straight trunks once rose high above swampy ground. Fossils of ancient ferns spread delicate patterns across slabs of stone. Horseales with their tall segmented stems appeared again and again within these deposits. Together, these fossils painted a vivid picture of the Carboniferous world. Layer after layer revealed dense forests that must have thrived in warm, humid wetlands. The remarkable preservation of these plants suggested that they had fallen into waterlogged environments where decay slowed dramatically. It was the perfect setting for the formation, bouldermation. But as paleobotanists continued studying these rock layers, a strange pattern began to emerge. In older layers, the fossils of swamp plants appeared almost everywhere. The same types of vegetation repeated across wide regions, suggesting that enormous wetlands once stretched continuously across the landscape. Then something changed. In younger layers of rock, the familiar plants of the swamp forests began appearing less often. The giant lycopods became rare, Certain fern species disappeared entirely. In their place, scientists began finding fossils of different plants. These new plants seemed better adapted to environments that were not permanently wet. Their structures suggested that they could survive periods of dryness. Some reproduced using seeds rather than spores, a strategy that allowed them to endure changing conditions. At first, researchers studying individual fossil sites believed these changes might reflect local environmental shifts. Perhaps a swamp had dried in one region, perhaps rivers had changed course. But as scientists compared fossil records across larger areas, the pattern repeated again and again. Across North America, across Europe, across regions separated by vast distances. The same story appeared in the rocks. Older layers revealed massive swamp forests. Younger layers showed ecosystems that looked very different. Something enormous had happened. The forests that once dominated the Carboniferous world had not simply changed in one location. They had declined across entire continents. Piece by piece, paleobotanists began assembling the evidence. Fossilized plants revealed the changing vegetation. Sediment layers recorded shifts in ancient environments. Coal deposits marked the remains of forests that had once grown across wetlands. What had first appeared as scattered geological clues slowly formed a coherent picture. A vast rainforest had once spread across the equatorial regions of the ancient Earth. Over time, that forest had fragmented, declined, and nearly vanished. The discovery transformed our understanding of deep time. It revealed that long before humans reshaped the planet's ecosystems, the Earth itself had experienced dramatic environmental transformations. Yet the fossil forests told only part of the story. Hidden within the rocks was another record, one far smaller, almost invisible to the naked eye, but capable of revealing even more detail about the vanished world. Because sometimes clues about the past are not the towering fossils of ancient trees. Sometimes they are grains so small they must be studied through a microscope. Some of the most powerful evidence for the disappearance of the Carboniferous rainforests does not come from towering fossilized trunks or preserved leaves. It comes from something far smaller, so small that it can easily pass unnoticed. Tiny grains of pollen and spores, no larger than dust, hold one of the most detailed records of ancient ecosystems ever discovered. When plants reproduce, they release enormous quantities of pollen or spores into the air. Some drift across forests before settling on soil or water. Others travel through rivers and lakes before sinking into layers of sediment. Over time, these microscopic particles become buried beneath new layers of mud and sand. And unlike many delicate structures in nature, pollen and spores are remarkably durable. Their outer walls are built from a tough biological material that resists decay, pressure, and even the slow grinding of geological time. Once sealed inside sediment, these tiny grains can survive for hundreds of millions of years. To scientists studying ancient environments, they are like pages from a forgotten archive. Each grain carries information about the plant that produced it. Under a microscope, their shapes and surface patterns reveal the species from which they came. Some appear smooth and rounded. Others carry delicate ridges or spines that help researchers distinguish one plant group from another. By examining thousands of these grains within a layer of rock, scientists can reconstruct the types of vegetation that once grew in that region. The process requires patience. Sediment samples are collected from carefully dated rock layers. In laboratories, these samples are treated with chemicals that dissolve surrounding minerals, leaving behind the tiny fossilized pollen grains hidden inside. Under powerful microscopes, researchers begin counting. Each sample may contain hundreds or even thousands of grains. By identilogging them, scientists can estimate which plants dominated the environment when that sediment was deposited. Wetlands first applied this technique to coniferous rock layers. They noticed the striking pattern. In older sediments, pollen from swamp forest plants appeared in overwhelming abundance. Spores from giant lycopods, ferns, and horsetails filled the microscopic record, suggesting that vast wetlands once stretched across these regions. The evidence aligned perfectly with the fossilized forests already discovered in coal deposits. But as scientists examined younger layers of rock, the pattern began to shift. The pollen of swamp plants became less common. In some regions it declined dramatically, replaced by grains belonging to plants better adapted to drier conditions. Seed plants began appearing more frequently. Other vegetation suited to seasonal climates gradually replaced the species that once thrived in permanently wet soils. What made the discovery even more compelling was its consistency. The same transition appeared in sediment records from different continents, in rock layers from Europe, North America, and other ancient equatorial regions. The pollen record told the same story. The forests had changed. Where enormous swamp ecosystems once dominated the landscape, more diverse plant communities began emerging. The microscopic evidence confirmed what fossilized plants had already hinted at. The Carboniferous rainforests had not simply declined in one place. And because sediment layers can often be dated with remarkable precision, scientists were able to reconstruct the timeline of this transformation. By tracing the shifts in pollen populations from one layer to the next, researchers could see how the rainforest ecosystem gradually gave way to new environments. What might have appeared invisible at first glance became unmistakable under a microscope. Millions of tiny grains, preserved in ancient rocks, revealed the story of a world changing. Through these microscopic clues, scientists could see the forests thinning, fragmenting, and eventually fading from dominance across vast regions of the planet. It was a discovery that transformed scattered observations into a clear narrative. The Carboniferous rainforest collapse was real, and its effects had reshaped ecosystems across the globe. But even with fossil forests and pollen records revealing what happened, one mystery remained. If such an enormous ecosystem could disappear across continents, what force had been powerful enough to trigger it? Somewhere within the shifting climate, drifting continents, and changing atmosphere lay the answer scientists were still searching for. Once the evidence of the Carboniferous rainforest collapse became clear, scientists found themselves facing a deeper and more complicated question. What could have caused it? Many of the great extinction events in Earth's history are linked to dramatic catastrophes. A massive asteroid strikes the planet. Volcanoes erupt across entire regions, filling the atmosphere with ash and gas. Climate shifts suddenly and life struggles to survive the shock. But the disappearance of the Carboniferous rainforests did not fit that pattern. There was no layer of debris marking a giant impact, no evidence of sudden volcanic destruction sweeping across the continents. The fossil record suggested something quieter and more gradual. The forests had not been destroyed in a single moment. They had slowly unraveled. To understand why, scientists began looking beyond the forests themselves and into the deeper processes shaping the planet. The first clues appeared in the movement of the continents. During the Carboniferous period, the Earth's landmasses were drifting steadily toward one another. Over millions of years, they gradually assembled into the enormous supercontinent known as Pangaea. This massive rearrangement of the planet's surface did more than change geography. It reshaped the climate. As continents merged, enormous interior regions formed far from the moderating influence of the oceans. Moist air that once traveled easily across smaller landmasses now struggled to reach these distant interiors. In many areas, rainfall patterns began shifting. Regions that had once experienced steady precipitation began developing more pronounced dry seasons. Wet periods still arrived, but they were interrupted by longer intervals of dryness. For ecosystems that depended on constant moisture, even small changes could become dangerous over time. At the same time, the collision of continents created new mountain ranges. These rising barriers altered the flow of atmospheric currents, redirecting winds and changing the paths of storm systems across the planet. Air that once carried moisture across equatorial forests was forced to travel along different routes. Rain began falling in new places, and in others it began falling less often. The forest responded slowly at first. Wetlands shrank around their edges, swamplands retreated toward rivers and deeper basins where water remained reliable. But climate alone may not tell the entire story. As the forests declined, another powerful feedback began unfolding within the atmosphere itself. For millions of years, Carboniferous vegetation had absorbed enormous amounts of carbon dioxide and locked it underground in the form of buried plant material. This process had gradually raised oxygen levels while reducing greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. But when the forest began shrinking, that balance changed. With fewer plants growing across the wetlands, less carbon was captured and buried. The atmospheric system that the forests had helped regulate began adjusting once again. Small shifts in atmospheric chemistry may have intensified the climate changes already underway. Scientists studying these ancient records have come to a striking conclusion. The collapse of the Carboniferous rainforest was not caused by a single event. It was the result of several forces acting together. Continental movement altered rainfall patterns. Mountain building redirected winds. Atmospheric chemistry shifted as ecosystems changed. Each factor destroyed the forests, but together they slowly pushed the ancient ecosystem beyond the conditions It had evolved to vave avo se vave. Over millions of years, the balance that once supported endless wetlands began typing in another direction. They faded, the forests faded, and the world that emerged from this long transformation looked very different from the humid planet that had existed before. Yet solving the mystery of why the rainforests collapsed leads to an equally fascinating question. If such an enormous ecosystem disappeared, what kind of world rose in its place? Because the end of one environment often marks the beginning of another. When the great rainforests of the Carboniferous world finally faded from dominance, the Earth that remained looked strikingly different from the one that had existed for millions of years before. The endless wetlands that once stretched across continents had largely vanished. The vast swamps where giant plants once stood in dense clusters no longer covered the equatorial lands. In their place appeared a world of contrasts, broad plains, winding river valleys, and forests that survived only in scattered patches where water remained dependable. From a distance, the landscape would have looked more open than the thick green world that came before. Instead of towering vegetation pressing against the sky, sunlight now reached farther across the ground. Rivers carved clearer paths through valleys, carrying seasonal floods rather than moving slowly through permanent marshes. Between these waterways stretched terrain that dried during parts of the year. The rhythm of the planet had changed. Rain still fell, but it no longer arrived with the same endless regularity. Seasons began shaping the landscape in ways that had rarely occurred during the height of the Carboniferous rainforest. For the plants of the old wetlands, this new environment was difficult to survive. The giant lycopods and many of the swamp ferns had evolved in soils that were constantly soaked. Their shallow roots depended on waterlogged ground, and their reproductive cycles relied on moisture that never seemed to disappear. As the climate shifted and soils dried more often, many of these ancient plants slowly declined. Yet the disappearance of one group of plants opened opportunities for others. Across the changing landscape, seed plants began expanding into regions that swamp vegetation could no longer dominate. Unlike plants that relied on spores drifting through moist air, these species reproduced through seeds protected by durable outer coverings. Inside each seed lay a small store of nutrients and a protective shell, allowing young plants to survive periods of dryness before taking root. This simple adaptation gave seed plants an extraordinary advantage in the new environments, spreading across the continents. They could grow where rainfall came in cycles. They could colonize soils that dried between storms. Slowly they spread across plains and riverbanks where the ancient swamp forests had once stood. Some of these early seed plants would eventually give rise to relatives of modern conifers and other hardy trees capable of thriving in seasonal climates. As plant life changed, the animals living within these environments faced a new evolutionary landscape as well. Amphibians, once dominant across the wetlands, continued struggling in many regions. Their dependence on water for reproduction limited how far they could travel into the expanding dry terrain. Some species survived near rivers, lakes, and the few remaining swampy areas. Others gradually disappeared from regions where permanent water had once been abundant. Reptiles, however, found themselves in a world that increasingly favored their abilities. Their eggs, protected from drying air by specialized membranes, allowed them to reproduce away from standing water. They could move across open landscapes and establish populations far from the shrinking wetlands. As the forests retreated and new ecosystems emerged, reptiles quietly expanded their presence. The transformation of the landscape did not happen in a single moment. It unfolded slowly, generation after generation, as plants and animals adjusted to the changing conditions. But by the time the Carboniferous world had fully given way to the next geological era, the difference was unmistakable. The planet was entering the Permian period. The ecosystems shaping this new age were built not around endless swamps, but around landscapes of rivers, forests, and plains where life had learned to endure changing seasons. The disappearance of the ancient rainforests had not simply erased an ecosystem. It had created space for new forms of life to emerge. And among those new inhabitants, reptiles were beginning to carry evolutionary innovations that would soon shape the future of life on Earth. As the ancient rainforests faded and the wetlands withdrew, a quiet shift in the balance of life began spreading across the land. The animals that had once dominated the humid Carboniferous world found themselves living in an environment that no longer favored their way of life. Amphibians remained tied to water, dependent on pools and marshes where their eggs could survive. But the planet they had ruled for millions of years was becoming less predictable, less saturated, and less forgiving to creatures bound to the wetlands. In that changing world, reptiles held a subtle but powerful advantage. Their secret lay in something deceptively simple. Instead of laying fragile eggs that needed constant moisture, reptiles carried their young inside protective shells known as amniotic eggs. These eggs contained membranes that kept the developing embryo safe from drying out, allowing the young animal to grow in a stable environment, even on dry land. It was a small biological difference, yet its consequences were enormous. With this innovation, reptiles were no longer prisoners of water. They could reproduce far from rivers and marshes. They could cross open ground where amphibians struggled to survive. Landscapes that had once been empty or dangerous suddenly became places reptiles could explore and inhabit. As the Earth moved deeper into the Permian period, these animals began spreading across the expanding plains and seasonal forests that replaced the old wetlands. At first they were small and unassuming creatures, moving quietly through the undergrowth or across the riverbanks. But over time, reptiles began experimenting with new ways of living. Evolution, given the freedom of these open environments, started to explore possibilities that had never existed in the swamp forests of the Carboniferous. Some reptiles grew into swift predators built for speed. Their limbs strengthened to carry them across dry terrain, chasing prey through forests and across open ground. Their bodies became more agile than the slow-moving amphibians that once dominated the wetlands. Others followed a different path. As new plant communities spread across the changing landscapes, certain reptiles adapted to feeding on vegetation. They evolved jaws capable of grinding tougher plant material and digestive systems suited for extracting nutrients from leaves and stems. In these early experiments, entire new ecological roles began appearing. Predators that hunted across land rather than water, herbivores that browsed across seasonal forests and plains, omnivores that could survive on a variety of foods as environments shifted. The diversity of reptiles slowly expanded as these lineages spread across the continents. Over millions of years, these early reptiles would give rise to branches of life far more dramatic than their humble beginnings suggested. From their descendants would eventually emerge the great reptilian dynasties of later ages. Some lineages would rise into the skies as pterosaurs, mastering the air long before birds evolved. Others would dominate the oceans as marine reptiles, ruling ancient seas with powerful bodies and streamlined shapes. And on land, reptiles would one day give rise to the most famous creatures in Earth's history, the dinosaurs. But at the moment these first reptiles began spreading across the Permian landscapes, none of that future existed yet. There were no towering predators stalking the plains, no colossal herbivores shaking the ground with each step. There were only small animals exploring a world newly opened to them. The collapse of the Carboniferous Rainforests, which once seemed like a devastating loss for life on Earth, had quietly created the conditions that allowed this new chapter of evolution to begin. In a wetter world, amphibians had ruled the land. In the drier landscapes that followed, reptiles began taking their place. What had once appeared as the decline of an ecosystem now revealed itself as something more complex. It was not simply an ending. It was the beginning of a long, evolutionary journey that would shape the next hundreds of millions of years. And yet, even the rise of reptiles was only part of the story. Because the consequences of the rainforest collapse would reach far beyond reptiles and dinosaurs, touching events that would unfold across the vast timeline of life on Earth. When scientists look back across the immense timeline of Earth's history, certain moments stand out as turning points, quiet shifts that redirected the path of life in ways no creature living at the time could possibly understand. The collapse of the Carboniferous rainforests was one of those moments. Before the forests began fading, the world operated under a very different set of conditions. Humid wetlands stretched across vast equatorial regions. Giant plants dominated the landscape, growing in soils that remained permanently soaked. Amphibians thrived within these environments, moving easily between land and water, as their ancestors had done for millions of years. The skies belonged to giant insects, creatures that could exist only in the oxygen, rich atmosphere maintained by those endless forests. It was a world that felt stable, even eternal. But as the climate slowly shifted and the forests fragmented, the foundation supporting that ancient ecosystem began disappearing. Wetlands shrank. Oxygen levels gradually declined. Landscapes that had once been dominated by water and vegetation gave way to more varied environments shaped by seasons and shifting rainfall. The creatures that had flourished in the old world struggled to adapt. Amphibians, tied closely to water, lost their advantage as dry landscapes expanded between shrinking wetlands. Giant arthropods, dependent on the unusual chemistry of the Carboniferous atmosphere, faded from the fossil record as oxygen levels slowly fell. The ecosystems that replaced them were built on entirely different principles. Instead of endless swamps, the new landscapes supported forests and plains where plants adapted to cycles of rain and drought. Seed plants spread across regions where moisture could not always be guaranteed, forming the foundations of new plant communities. Among the animals moving through these environments, reptiles gradually emerged as the dominant inhabitants of the land. Freed from the need to reproduce in water, they could explore habitats that amphibians could not reach. Their expansion across the changing landscapes marked the beginning of a new chapter in the evolution of terrestrial. Would come lineages that would dominate the planet for hundreds of millions of years. Some would grow into the dinosaurs, animals that would rule the earth, long before humans ever had. Others would eventually give rise to birds, creatures that still fill the skies today. And among the many branches of life evolving in the wake of the rainforest collapse, another lineage would quietly emerge. Small, warm-blooded animals that would one day evolve into mammals. Much later still, one branch of those mammals would produce a species capable of studying its own distant past. When viewed from this perspective, the Carboniferous rainforest collapse becomes something far more significant than a forgotten ecological event. It represents a moment when the direction of evolution quietly shifted. The ancient world of giant insects and endless wetlands slowly gave way to ecosystems that made later life possible. The rise of reptiles, the age of dinosaurs, the eventual appearance of mammals and humans. All of these developments unfolded along a path that may have begun when those ancient forests started disappearing. It is a reminder that the events shaping our world do not always announce themselves with dramatic force. Sometimes the most important changes occur slowly, hidden within the long rhythms of climate and evolution. 300 million years ago, a vast rainforest ecosystem collapsed across the planet. No human witnessed it, yet the consequences of that quiet transformation still echo through the history of life, reaching all the way to the present. And understanding that ancient shift raises a question that feels strangely relevant today. If ecosystems once powerful enough to reshape the planet could disappear, what lessons might their story hold for the world we are living in now? Carboniferous rainforests had largely disappeared. The Earth had entered a phase that would have felt unfamiliar even to the creatures that survived the transformation. The endless wetlands that once stretched across equatorial continents were no longer the defining feature of the planet. In their place appeared landscapes that breathed with a different rhythm, a rhythm shaped not by constant humidity, but by cycles of wet and dry. The old world of permanent swamps had faded. Across vast regions where water once pooled year-round, the ground began to harden beneath the sun. Swamps dried into wide floodplains where rivers still flowed, but their waters now rose and fell with the seasons. During wetter months, rivers spilled across the land, leaving layers of fresh sediment behind. When dry periods returned, the same ground baked beneath open skies. This change transformed the physical appearance of the planet. Where towering vegetation had once formed dense walls of green, open spaces now stretched across the landscape. Patches of forest still survived near rivers and low basins where moisture collected, but they were smaller and more scattered than the endless rainforests of the past. The earth had begun learning a new balance. In many places, the soil itself recorded the shift. Sediment layers formed during this period reveal patterns of alternating wet and dry conditions. Fine mud, deposited by seasonal floods, sits beside cracked surfaces that once baked under long dry spells. These geological records show that rainfall had become less predictable, arriving in cycles rather than constant abundance. The ancient greenhouse world of the Carboniferous was fading. In its place emerged a planet shaped by variation. For the plants and animals that inhabited this new environment, survival required different strategies. Species that had depended on permanently wet habitats faced increasing pressure as wetlands continued shrinking. Many of the giant swamp plants that once dominated the forests disappeared from large regions of the earth. In their place, new forms of vegetation spread across the land. Plants capable of enduring dryness began colonizing open terrain. Seed plants, already gaining advantages during the decline of the forests, expanded further into landscapes where moisture fluctuated from season to season. Their seeds could wait patiently through dry periods, protected until the arrival of rain allowed new growth to begin. Gradually, the vegetation of the planet reorganized itself around these new conditions. Animals followed a similar path of adaptation. Amphibians, which had flourished in the wetlands of the Carboniferous world, continued surviving near rivers and lakes. But across the wider landscape their presence diminished as dry ground expanded beyond the boundaries of the remaining swamps. Reptiles, however, moved confidently through this changing terrain. Freed from the requirement of water, boundary production, they crossed floodplains and forests alike. They adapted to environments that fluctuated between wet and dry seasons, slowly expanding into ecosystems that had not existed during the height of the rainforest era. The frank transformation reshaped the character of the planet. The Carboniferous world had been humid, dense, and strangely alien when viewed through the lens of modern ecosystems. But the Earth emerging from the collapse began looking more familiar. Seasonal rivers, open landscapes, and forests adapted to shifting climates became the foundation of the new ecological order. It was a world far closer to the one we recognize today. And within this transformed environment, evolution was already exploring new possibilities. Because systems change, they create opportunities for different forms of life to rise. The creatures best suited for this burgeoning planet were beginning to spread quietly across its landscapes, preparing to shape the next great chapter of Earth's history. When the great rainforests of the Carboniferous world began collapsing, the change did not simply remove species from the landscape. It also created something far less obvious but equally powerful. It created opportunity. In stable environments, evolution tends to move slowly. Species adapt gradually to conditions that remain relatively constant over long periods of time. But when the world begins shifting, when climates change, habitats fragment, and ecosystems reorganize, natural selection suddenly becomes far more intense. Must adapt quickly. The aftermath of the rainforest collapse was exactly this kind of environment. Landscapes that once remained stable for millions of years were now unpredictable. Wetlands appeared and vanished. Forests gave way to open terrain. Rivers changed their courses as rainfall patterns shifted. For the plants and animals living through this transformation, survival depended on flexibility. Some lineages struggled to adjust and gradually faded from the fossil record. Others responded with remarkable bursts of innovation. Reptiles were among the most successful participants in this evolutionary experiment. In the older Carboniferous ecosystems, they had existed mostly as small and relatively minor inhabitants of the forest floor. But the disappearance of the vast wetlands opened enormous stretches of new habitat that amphibians could not easily occupy. Reptiles moved into these spaces with surprising speed. Over generations, their bodies began adapting to the demands of this changing world. Some species developed stronger limbs capable of supporting their weight across dry ground, allowing them to move efficiently through forests and across plains. Others evolved longer legs and lighter bodies suited for speed. These reptiles could pursue prey through open landscapes, where the dense vegetation of the old swamps no longer blocked their movement. Even their feeding habits began diversifying. Some reptiles became specialized predators, hunting insects and small animals that thrived in the new ecosystems. Others adapted to feeding on plants, evolving jaws capable of handling tougher vegetation that grew in the increasingly seasonal climate. The result was an expanding variety of reptilian forms spreading across the continents. What had once been a small group of animals was rapidly branching into new evolutionary directions. Plants were undergoing a similar transformation. The ancient swamp forests had been dominated by plants that reproduced through spores, a strategy that worked well in environments where moisture was always available. But as rainfall became less predictable, spore-producing plants faced new challenges. Their reproductive cycles depended on water. Seed plants, however, possessed a remarkable advantage. Their embryos developed inside protective structures that could survive dry conditions for long periods of time. A seed could remain dormant until the arrival of rain provided the right conditions for growth. This adaptation allowed seed plants to spread into landscapes that earlier vegetation could not colonize. Across the plains and seasonal forests of the early Permian world, these plants began establishing new ecosystems. Their roots reached into soils that dried between rains. Their seeds traveled across open terrain carried by wind and water. Over time, the vegetation of the planet began reorganizing itself around these hardy pioneers. Together, these biological changes transformed the structure of life on Earth. New predator-prey relationships formed. Fresh plant communities reshaped food webs. Animals adapted to climates that shifted with the seasons rather than remaining permanently wet. the pace of evolution quickened. Lineages branched and diversified as life explored new ways of surviving in an unpredictable environment. Creatures experimented with new body shapes, diets, and strategies for reproduction. What initially appeared as a catastrophic collapse now revealed a deeper pattern. Destruction had opened space for innovation. From the fragments of the ancient rainforest ecosystem, entirely new biological systems were merging, and these experiments were only the beginning. Because the evolutionary changes unfolding across the planet were quietly constructing the foundations of a new world that would soon define the Permian period and shape the future of life for millions of years to come. As the long transition following the rainforest collapse continued, the planet slowly entered a new chapter in its history. Millions of years had passed since the endless swamps of the Carboniferous dominated the equatorial lands. The world emerging from that transformation now belonged to a different geological era. This was the beginning of the Permian period. To an observer, the difference would have been striking. The humid forests filled with towering clumbuses and giant insects had largely disappeared from the landscape. In their place stretched environments, shaped by rivers, forests of new plant species, and wide plains that experienced cycles of rain and dryness. The ecosystems forming during this time bore little resemblance to the ancient rainforest world. Plant life had reorganized around species capable of surviving in changing climates. Seed plants spread across the continents, their reproductive strategies allowing them to endure dry periods that earlier swamp vegetation could not tolerate. These plants formed forests and woodlands adapted to the seasonal rhythms that now defined the planet's climate. Among these growing forests and open terrains, animals were also changing. Reptiles continued expanding across the landscapes, filling ecological roles that had rarely existed before the rainforest collapse. Some evolved into swift predators capable of traveling long distances across open ground in pursuit of prey. Others adapted to feeding on the new vegetation spreading across the plains. The structure of ecosystems began shifting toward more complex relationships. Predators no longer waited in murky pools or dense swamp vegetation for passing prey. Instead, they pursued animals across open terrain where speed and agility became essential tools for survival. Herbivores grazed and browsed among forests and plains, feeding on plants that thrived in the new climate. These evolving food webs created ecosystems that were far more varied than the relatively uniform wetlands of the Carboniferous. The balance of life was changing. Amphibians, once the dominant animals of the ancient swamps, gradually retreated into environments where water remained abundant. Rivers, lakes, and the few remaining wetlands continued supporting these creatures, but their influence across the broader landscape diminished. Reptiles, by contrast, continued spreading into habitats where amphibians struggled to survive. Their ability to reproduce away from standing water gave them access to vast regions of land that had previously remained inaccessible to many vertebrates. Over time, reptiles diversified into numerous forms, experimenting with different body structures and lifestyles suited to the emerging ecosystems. The Permian world became a stage where these evolutionary experiments unfolded. Across forests, plains, and river valleys, reptiles and seed plants formed the backbone of new ecological systems that replaced the vanished rainforests. Each generation adapted slightly more to the shifting climates, strengthening the presence of these new lineages. What had once been a planet defined by endless wetlands was now a world shaped by diversity. Different regions developed combinations of vegetation, animals, and climate patterns. Some areas supported dense forests adapted to seasonal rainfall. Others became more open landscapes where life depended on surviving both wet and dry conditions. The rainforest collapse had quietly reset the biological structure of the planet. By ecosystems, it opened space for environmentalisms to ecosystems receive. Reptiles became the most adaptable inhabitants of the land. Seedy plants breed across continents. The consequences of this transformation would stretch far beyond the Permian period itself. From these early reptilian lineages would eventually emerge the ancestors of creatures that would dominate the Earth for hundreds of millions of years. The stage for the age of reptiles had been prepared not by a sudden catastrophe, but by the slow disappearance of a rainforest that once covered the planet. Yet the story does not end here, because the effects of the Carboniferous rainforest collapse did not stop with the rise of the Permian world. Its consequences would ripple forward through time, shaping events that unfolded long after the forests themselves had vanished. About the great turning points in the history of life, certain events immediately come. The minded parts that ended the BSBC, we caps the most famous von sing life, mark be fire, darkness thus. It is dramatic, easy to imagine, and clearly recorded in the rocks as a sharp boundary between two worlds. But not all transformations in Earth's history announce themselves with such clarity. Some unfold slowly, quietly reshaping the planet, while leaving behind only faint traces scattered across time. The Carboniferous Rainforest collapse belongs to this quieter category of planetary change. For a long time it remained almost invisible. There was no single catastrophic layer of ash or debris marking its arrival. No dramatic extinction horizon separating one world from another. Instead, the evidence lies dispersed across continents, hidden within countless layers of sediment and fossilized plants. At first glance, the rocks reveal only subtle changes, and swamp plants dominate the next. Those plants subtly, Polan records begin shifting towards Befekes, Adapati, Flamant. Each piece of evidence seems small on its own. But when scientists began assembling these clues from sites around the world, a larger pattern slowly came into focus. The endless rainforests that once wrapped around the equator had fragmented and declined. Wetlands that supported dense ecosystems of amphibians and giant insects had shrunk or vanished. In their place emerged landscapes shaped by seasonal climates and expanding dry regions. The transformate across millions of years, on Earth, because the process was so slow, no single generation of big to the animals and plants living within those ancient forests, the world probably seemed to change only slightly from one generation to the next. Yet, over immense spans of time, those small changes accumulated, wetlands retreated, forests fragmented, atmospheric chemistry shifted, new plant communities appeared, reptiles spread across environments that amphibians could no longer dominate. By the time the transformation was complete, the structure of the planet's ecosystems had been fundamentally altered. The ancient Carboniferous world, a humid planet dominated by swamps, amphibians, and giant arthropods, had given way to something entirely different. The new world emerging from that collapse would eventually support the rise of reptiles, the dominance of dinosaurs, and later the appearance of mammals. Those first part of their origin to their disappearance, for the event that helped make those futures possible. Mawanard largely. Until paleontologists' careful record, Canopy, was not pen alias, the full picture begantologists. Thigfelf not asatra but asatpaya turning point in the long story of life. Sometimes the most powerful changes on Earth do not thrive. With fire to fire tive kondala fire. Rainforest ecosystem that once covered regions of the Earth slowly favatin leads naturally to elihautly to direction, a vevelutin for everything. That followed understanding the scale of that transformation leads naturally to another question. What would the Earth look like today if those ancient rainforests had never disappeared? History often feels inevitable when viewed from the present. The rise of reptiles, the age of dinosaurs, the emergence of mammals, and eventually the appearance of humans can seem like a natural sequence of events written into the fabric of the planet. But the deeper scientists look into Earth's past, the more they discover that many of these outcomes depended on fragile turning points. The collapse of the Carboniferous rainforests may have been one of those turning points. To understand its significance, it helps to imagine a different path, a world in which those forests never disappeared. Continuing to spread across this compound century, the endless Carboniferous rainforest continue dense. Oxygen levels remain unusually high as forests continue locking deep underground. In such a world, the atmosphere itself would remain different. The rich oxygen concentrations that once allowed insects to grow to extraordinary sizes might persist for millions of additional years. Giant dragonflies could continue drifting through humid skies, while enormous arthropods crawled through dense vegetation. The strange, alien ecosystems of the Carboniferous might not fade into history at all. They might continue evolving, refining themselves in a stable and waterlogged world. And within those endless wetlands, amphibians would likely remain the dominant animals on land. The air life cycles were perfectly suited to environments filled with water. Eggs could develop safely in shallow pools. Young could mature in swamps before venturing onto land. In a world where moisture never disappeared, amphibians would have little competition. Reptiles, on the other hand, might never gain the advantage that changing climates eventually gave them. Without expanding dry regions and seasonal landscapes, the evolutionary innovation of the amniotic egg would provide far less benefit. Reptiles might remain small, secondary inhabitants of the forest floor, overshadowed by amphibians that continued thriving in the wetlands. The ripple effects of this difference could reach far into the future. If reptiles never spread widely across terrestrial environments, the evolutionary branches that later produced dinosaurs might never develop in the same way. Tis the dobby ari abi olis mither than his mighty swantitities, white never takes his at dominati. Lananadana. Which his athletivs would look profoundly different. Mammals which rose to prominence after the extinction of the dinosaurs might remain small and inconspicuous creatures living in the shadows of larger amphibians and arthropods. The entire structure of terrestrial life might follow a completely different trajectory. Even the appearance of humans, an outcome shaped by countless evolutionary steps, might become far less likely in such a world. Of course, this vision remains speculative. The Earth's history is shaped by countless interacting forces, and no single event determines every outcome that follows. Yet, exploring these possibilities reveals something important. The collapse of the Carboniferous rainforests was not merely a local ecological shift. It was a moment that altered the conditions under which evolution unfolded. By transclimate, vegetation, and Ethosphers created opportunities for new groups of organisms to expand and diversify. The reptiles, the later emergence of dinosaur, appearance of mandarins, all developed pathways that may have been opened by this. An environment. 300 missionary shang. No tit die the story. Of life toward the world, we know to the significance. Yet across the vast span of to span of geological time. And while this collapse occurred in a distant era far removed from human history, the lessons hidden within it reach far beyond ancient ecosystems. Because the forces that reshape environments are not confined to the distant past. For millions of years, the Carboniferous rainforests seemed unshakable. They covered enormous regions of the earth, thriving under warm skies and constant rain. Towering plants filled the wetlands, amphibians ruled the waters. Giant insects drifted through thick oxygen-rich air. To any creature living within that world, the forests must have appeared permanent. But permanence in nature is often an illusion. Forces that shape ecosystems rarely arrive with sudden violence. More often they move quietly through shifts in temperature, rainfall, and atmospheric balance. These changes may be small at first, almost impossible to notice within the span of a single lifetime. Yet, over thousands and millions of years, even the smallest adjustments can reshape the world. The Carboniferous rainforests did not vanish because of a single catastrophic event. Then it slowly changed. Rainfall pattern shifted to context of the balance. The had allowed the forests to plalas for so long. Of these pontifications, for millions of years the ecosystem remained stable, supported by constant moisture and predictable environmental conditions. When that stability weakened, the forests began fragmenting. Wetlands shrank. Giant swamp plants struggled to survive outside their ideal habitats. Once fragmentation began, the pace of ecological change accelerated. Species that depended on the old wetlands disappeared from large regions. New plants spread across drying landscapes. Reptiles moved into habitats that amphibians could not easily occupy. Entire biological communities reorganized themselves around the new conditions. The forests that had once shaped the atmosphere and supported giant insects gradually became part of the geological past. Their disappearance did not mean the end of life's creativity. The collapse of the rainforest created opportunities for new ecosystems to emerge. Plants adapted to seasonal climates spread across the continents. Animals evolved new strategies for surviving in environments that fluctuated between wet and dry. The planet moved forward, building new systems from the remnants of the old. This pattern stability, followed by transformation, is woven throughout Earth's history. Ecosystems appear stable for immense spans of time, but they are always responding to the pressures of climate, geography, and biological change. When those pressures reach certain thresholds, entire environments can reorganize in ways that seem sudden when viewed from the long perspective of geological time. The Carboniferous rainforest collapse offers one of the clearest examples of this process. It reminds us that ecosystems, even enormous ones, depend on delicate balances between atmosphere, climate, and life. Change any one of those elements, and the system itself may begin to shift. Scientists studying ancient events like this one often describe the Earth as a dynamic system. a planet where life and environment constantly influence one another. Plants alter the atmosphere. Climate shapes vegetation. Animals evolve within the conditions those interactions create. Understanding how these forces interacted hundreds of millions of years ago helps researchers better understand the systems that shape our world today. The forests of the Carboniferous period may be long gone, buried beneath layers of rock and coal, but their story still carries meaning. It reveals both the resilience and the vulnerability of life on Earth. Resilience, because new ecosystems always emerge from change. Vulnerability, because even the most powerful environments can disappear when the conditions that sustain them begin to shift. 300 million years ago, a rainforest ecosystem that once seemed endless slowly faded from the planet. The Earth adapted. Life continued. But the Les Ancients remains quietly relevant. But forces capable of transforming scales did not vanish with the Carboniferous world. We're still shaping the planet today. Now, for the first time in Earth's long history, one species has begun into fossil. To understand what that might mean, the story must move forward from ancient forests to the present world. A world where humanity has begun altering the planet in ways that echo transformations from deep time. The forests of today look very different from the vast swamp worlds of the Carboniferous period. Modern trees are smaller than the towering lycopods that once dominated ancient wetlands. The giant insects of that era have long vanished, and the ecosystems surrounding today's forests are shaped by animals and plants that evolved millions of years after those ancient rainforests disappeared. Yet beneath those differences redia through atmosphere, and release axi and release oxygen. Liso oscifrances lefed tweetia twoxy, and release adaxid and release oxygen. In doing so, forests influence the chemistry of the atmosphere itself. They store enormous soil, shaping the balance between gases that warm the planet and those that cool it. This sense forests are not just collections of trees. They center a part of the Earth's climate system, regulate rainfall by releasing water vapor into the air. They influence wind patterns and cloud formation. Entire regional climates depend on the presence of large forest ecosystems. This was true during the Carboniferous period, when vast swamp forests helped shape the atmosphere that allowed giant insects to thrive, and it remains true today. Modern rainforests perform similar functions, though is this more visible than in tropical regions, such as the Amazon, where forests shat across enormous areas and play a major role in regulating global. They absorb billions of tons of dioxide each year, while lestigation helps drive rainfall across entire continental space. They share their space. But just as the ancient rainforests once fragmented, modern forests pressures that are changing their structure. Many region are being cleared or large continuous ecosystems are split into separate by far spanning settlagen, but the ecolabascan spread far vagan howl moves how water moves events ask and ecozoncal. Effects can spread far beyond the spuffer's bars, and when behave differently from thensars. Over time, these fragmented landscapes can begin behaving very differently from the continuous forests that once covered the same land. Scientists studying modern deforestation have noticed something familiar in these patterns. The fragmentation occurring in parts of the Amazon and other tropical forests bears a striking resemblance to the ecological processes that occurred during the Carboniferous rainforest collapse. In both cases, continuous forest systems begin dividing into smaller islands of vegetation surrounded by expanding areas of open terrain. The timescales are dramatically different. Across millions of years as closet and continents moved. Modern changes are occurring far more quickly, driven by human activity within a few centuries. Yet the underlying ecological process sees surprising parallels. As fragment species lose the ability to move freely across landscapes within the forest change, so shift in animals, faux regions where they once we see isephitas, full esifar shiftamations do not always be. Often they just as they did in the fear. Until the come effects become difficult to know, crethi no. This does not mean the modern world is destined to repeat the same outcome. But studying the Carboniferous rainforest collapse provides scientists with a valuable perspective. It reveals how large ecosystems respond when environmental conditions change, and when forests begin losing the stability that once supported them. 300 million years ago, the disappearance of vast forests helped reshape the planet's ecosystems. Asken epistijs an important question. Wal pfistij stief orzikistijstem. The fifimigens that histim them piestemias fifamilskastum. Forthi skyfici of the epistijstems oxystems ifustems. Oceans collide across entire geological eras. From the perspective of any crit in them, these systems may seem permanent, using a simple ID. The deeper record of the planet tells a different story. Sometimes ecosystems remain balanced right up until the moment they no longer. Our scientists describe this phenomenon. An ecosystem may absorb small changes for long periods of time without collapsing. Temperatures may rise slightly, rainfall patterns may shift. Species may adapt gradually to new conditions. For a while, the system adjusts. But once certain thresholds are, the balance can shift rapidly. What once seemed stable begins reorganizing itself into something entirely different. The Carboniferous Rainforest collapse provides one of the earliest known examples of this process. For millions of years, those forests covered vast regions of the planet. They regulated the atmosphere, supported enormous biodiversity, and appeared stable across immense spans of time. Yet, as rainfall patterns shifted and climate slowly changed, the system moved closer to a threshold. At first, the changes were subtle. Wetlands shrank around their edges. Forests fragmented into smaller regions. Species adapted where they could. But eventually the balance tipped. The endless rainforests that once dominated the equatorial world reorganized into entirely different ecosystems. Open landscapes replaced swamps. Reptiles expanded where amphibians had once ruled. The structure of life on land shifted toward new forms. What had seemed permanent proved surprisingly sensitive to long-term environmental pressure. Today, scientists study tipping points in many parts of the modern Earth system. Rainforests themselves are one example. Large forest ecosystems help regulate their own rainfall by releasing moisture into the atmosphere. When enough forest is removed, that cycle can weaken, potentially pushing the region toward drier conditions. Coral reefs offer another example. Healthy reefs can recover from storms or temporary warming, but sustained environmental stress may eventually push them beyond the point where recovery is possible. Even the polar ice systems of the planet are studied through this lens. Ice sheets can remain stable for thousands of years, yet under certain conditions they may begin retreating in ways that accelerate further change. These ideas are not predictions of inevitable collapse. Instead, they reflect an attempt to understand how complex systems behave under pressure. The lesson from the Carboniferous period is not simply that ecosystems can change. It is that enormous systems that seem too vast to fail may still depend on delicate balances. Rainfall patterns, atmospheric chemistry, plant communities, and animal populations all interact with one another. When those interactions shift enough, the entire system can reorganize in ways that appear sudden from the perspective of geological time. By studying ancient transformations like the rainforest collapse, scientists gain a deeper understanding of how these processes unfold. The past becomes a kind of laboratory. It allows researchers to examine what happens when ecosystems experience long-term environmental pressure. It reveals how climate, vegetation, and life influence one another over immense spans of time. And perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that the stability we see in the present is only one moment within a much longer story. The forests, oceans, brennamates that shape our world today are part of systems that have changed many times before. And our vast rainforest ecosystem crossed a threshold, the future of life on Earth. As we approach the final chapter of this story, the question becomes less about ancient forests and more about something deeper. What do these transformations reveal about the nature of life itself on a constantly changing life itself? The story of the Carboniferous rainforests begins with a world that seemed endless. Vast wetlands stretched across continents. Towering plants filled the air with oxygen. Amphibians and giant insects thrived in ecosystems that appeared stable beyond imagination. Yet those forests are gone. Their disappearance reminds us of something fundamental about the planet we live on. Earth has never been still. Continents drift slowly across the surface of the globe, colliding and separating over millions of years. Mountains rise where those continents meet, only to erode away again across the ages. Oceans open and close. Climates warm and cool in long cycles that stretch far beyond the span of human history. Life moves with those changes. Flourish when conditions allow them to thrive. But no coastscapes. Coral reefs grow in warm seas, and entire communities of plants and animals form delicate networks of interaction. But no coast system. Me means each engage verwässung. When climate shift, when geography rearranges itself, or when atmospheric chemistry evolves, life responds. Some species adapt, others vanish. New organisms emerge to occupy environments that did not exist before. The Carboniferous rainforests were once among the most powerful ecosystems the Earth had ever known. They reshaped the atmosphere by absorbing carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen. They supported creatures that seem almost mythical today. Dragonflies the size of birds, enormous arthropods moving through dense vegetation, amphibians ruling the wetlands. For millions of years, those forests dominated the equatorial world. Yet even ecosystems of such scale were not immune to the slow changes unfolding across the planet. As continents drifted and climates shifted, the balance that sustained the rainforests began to weaken. Wetlands shrank. Forests fragmented. New environments appeared where ancient swamp plants could no longer survive. The forests faded. But the disappearance of those ecosystems did not mark the end of life's story. Instead, it opened space for new evolutionary possibilities. Reptiles expanded into the emerging landscapes. Seed plants spread across drying soils. Ecosystems reorganized around climates, shaped by seasons rather than constant moisture. From those changes would eventually emerge the age of reptiles, the rise of dinosaurs, the later expansion of mammals, and far down the timeline of evolution, the appearance of humans. In this way, the vanished forests of the Carboniferous world continue influencing the present. Their remains lie buried beneath layers of rock and soil. Coal deposits formed from their ancient vegetation still rest deep underground. The evolutionary pathways they helped create eventually led to the ecosystems that surround us today. Every forest, every desert, every mountain valley carries echoes of transformations that occurred long before humans existed. The landscapes we see now are only the latest chapter in a story that began billions of years ago. The Earth continues changing. New ecosystems will emerge. Others will fade into the geological record. The cycle of this planet, the cycle of ovovovovite collapse, is not simply a forgettament in Antinkhistu will continue as long as life on Earth is part of a constantly evolving system. Yet their legacy remains woven into the world beneath our feet. And understanding that legacy invites us to see our own place in Earth's story, not as the end of the journey, but as another moment in a long and ever-changing timeline of life. Long after the great Carboniferous rainforests faded from the surface of the Earth, their story did not end. The towering plants that once filled the swamps did not simply disappear into the past. Instead, their remains followed a quieter path, one that would unfold slowly beneath layers of sediment and stone. The forests sank into the earth. Down was often satry toward out wind. When to clouds across they dort. Their mightiest plants lived into 8 oxys, black waters, pointies os. Fresh sediment carried by rivers and floods covered these layers of plant velici, the dewelans, bedwelans, and werdewelans, as Beverseckers knew. Forests guessed knew for above them. The process repeated again and again, generation after generation. Over immense spans of time, these layers thickened. Pressure built above the buried forests. The weight of the earth slowly compressed the organic material. Heat from deep within the plant altered its cubaltibit structure. Walt Brand's site forming the once living vegetation into something very different. War had once been to warring plant had once been to warring plants. And sangled forests gradually became coal. Formed quietly beneath the ground, Volti and Fiat all, the Barthams came and went above them, quantient across the planet. Hundreds of millions of years passed before another species would discover them. When humans eventually began digging into the earth in search of fuel, they encountered these ancient deposits. Miners cutting through rock layers revealed thick seams of coal stretching deep underground. At first, these deposits were valued simply as a powerful source of energy. But in time, scientists recognized what they truly represented. Each Seisentfester, the Darkward, Forkad, Bingens had once been living Zetatat, parts millions of years ago. Of millions of years ago, Cardawidi Che Cand, Injike, Gamenjani. Energies and trunks was now being released again. Factories, bow machines, railroads carried it across continents. But TCDs used it to generate heat and electricity. The industrial world that humans built to harn this buried calmness. In a sense, modern civilization began running on the remains of a vanished ecosystem. The fact that not disappear, they had simply chown part of long before south, or even plows CD festi, van de flauwstofitiste. The energy stored in those rocks is the accumulated sunlight of the Carboniferous age. plants captured that energy through photosynthesis. Their remains locked it away beneath the swamps. Geological processes preserved it across unimaginable spans of time. And when humans finally discovered it, that ancient sunlight began fueling an entirely new chapter in the planet's story. The buried forests had shaped evolution by altering the atmosphere and transforming ecosystems. But their influence did not end there, because the carbon locked within those ancient plants would eventually help power the industrial societies humans would build, linking the vanished rainforests of deep time to the modern world in ways few people ever realize. For hundreds of millions of years, the remains of the Carboniferous rainforests rested silently beneath the earth. Buried beneath rock and sediment, the ancient plant material slowly transformed into coal, storing vast quantities of carbon and energy within the planet's crust. Nothing living on the surface knew it was there. Entire ages of life passed above those buried forests. Dinosaurs rose and vanished. Mammals spread across the continents. Ice ages came and went. The world changed again and again, while deep underground the compressed remains of those ancient ecosystems waited. Then, relatively recently in the long history of the planet, humans began to uncover them. At first, coal was simply another useful substance found within the ground. It burned hotter and longer than wood, making it a valuable fuel for heating homes and forging metal. But as human societies grew and technology advanced, coal began playing a far greater role. During the 18th and 19th centuries, a transformation began sweeping across parts of the world. Machines appinned, pump water from mines, and power new forms of transportation. These machines required a reliable and powerful source of energy. Coal provided exactly that. Charl provided exactly that. Whole by exact. All and exactly that. Factories filled with mechanical looms and presses began producing goods on a scale that had never existed before. Across teen industrialfaffer, body tauju production savdi and powering these machines had been capture powering these machines, had been energy powering these machines, had been catchy powering the tides that the end powering these machines, had been gasavdi. Long before steam engines and factories existed, Carboniferous plants had absorbed sunlight through photosynthesis. They had pulled carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and stored energy within their tissues as they grew in the endless wetlands. When those plants died, their remains sank into swampy ground, where they were buried and transformed into coal. They captured remained locked within those ancient layers. When coal bowled and siphon engines that stored energy was being released again, a sense the machines of the Industrial Revolution were powered by sunlight captured in this world. The connection between those ancient forests and modern civilization is both unexpected and profound. Without the Kaustabi, no vast Kaustar, beneath the Kauster. Without those Kaufers Varf, the early Indo-Industrial Farkanafar would Wasapkan of Eskantamasat Warmsa Seti. Steam-powered locomotives, factories and power stations all relied on energy store within those ancient plants. Effluence of that buried ecosystem fuels power plants in many parts of the world degenerate from its combustion travels through networks of loopholes that are rooted in power industries. The foundations of modern infrastructure were built, in part, on the remains of prehistoric forests. In a strange way, the Carboniferous rainforest collapse helped shape the conditions that would eventually allow humans to transform the planet. Those forests absorbed carbon from the atmosphere, locking it underground for hundreds of millions of years. When humans discovered that stored energy, they used it to power machines capable of reshaping landscapes, economies, and entire societies. The ancient forests had vanished from the surface of the earth, but their influence had not disappeared. It flowed through furnaces and engines, through railways and factories, through the electricity that lit growing cities. The sunlight captured by prehistoric plants was now driving the technological expansion of human civilization. Yet this connection between ancient forests and modern industry carries another consequence as well. The carbon that once lay safely buried beneath the ground is gradually returning to the atmosphere. And that realization leads to another reflection about the deep connections between the past and the present. Hundreds of millions of years ago, the forests of the Carboniferous world performed a quiet transformation of the planet's atmosphere. They absorbed leaves of corpset from the air and luth their cortario, containaiwand. Leaves and folkstad, wittian those plants died. Instead of decomposing completely, the vegetation mosie ck layers billions. Over time, sediment buried those layers. Pressure increased. Heat slowly altered the structure of the plant material. The result was coal. For hundreds of millions of years, the carbon captured by those forests remained sealed underground. It became part of the planet's geological memory, a vast archive of ancient sunlight, stored safely beneath rock and soil. While the surface world changed again, that carbon remained undisturbed, lived and vanished. Malifers lickers begins back to the surface. Game and went at the carbon locked within those Amphibian forests. Remained vift liefened the long line of verse. History did Humes begin bring it back to the surface. When coal is mined and burned, the carbon that once formed ancient plant tissue reacts with oxygen in the air. The result is carbon dioxide, the same gas that Carboniferous plants had removed from the atmosphere so long ago. In a sense, the process reverses the work those forests performed. Energy captured millions of years ago is released as heat and motion, powering engines and genpast of the present. Nals, the time, Thomb, that was better, Bal hobby, was Bekov, that slowly turns to the atmosphere. Bal the Sarkadistant passed with the present. When the Carboniferous forests thrived, they gradually reduced the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, while increasing oxygen levels. This transformation helped shape the climate and ecosystems of that ancient world. Today, by burning the coal formed from those forests, humanity is reintroducing the ancient carbon into the atmosphere once again. The timescale of this exchange is remarkable. The forests removed carbon slowly across millions of years. The burial of their remains locked it underground for an even longer period. No, within only a few centuries, humans are releasing portions of that stored carbon back into the air. This does not mean the modern world is simply repeating the past. The Earth's climate system is complex, shaped by oceans, vegetation, atmospheric chemistry, and countless natural processes interacting across vast scales of time. But the connection between ancient ecosystems and modern climate reveals something profound. The atmosphere we breathe today carries the legacy of forests that vanished before the age of dinosaurs. Every molecule of carbon dioxide in the air has its own history. Some have circulated through oceans and volcanic eruptions. Others once passed through the leaves of prehistoric plants growing in the swamps of the Carboniferous period. The Earth's systems are not isolated events, separated by distant eras. They are part of a continuous cycle, stretching across geological time. The forests that once shaped the atmosphere did not disappear entirely when their ecosystems collapsed. Their influence remains embedded in the carbon buried beneath the ground and in the air surrounding the planet today. The story of the Carboniferous rainforest collapse is therefore not confined to the distant past. It is woven into the present too. Understanding this connection reveals something essential about the planet we inhabit. Earth's climate, ecosystems, and atmosphere are all linked within cycles that unfold across immense spans of time. When we study ancient forests, we are not simply examining a vanished world. We are observing a chapter in the ongoing story of life and climate on Earth. And with the buried forests and their long legacy now revealed, the story approaches its final reflection. What does this forgotten transformation ultimately tell us about the nature of life on a planet that never stops changing? When we look at the Earth today, it can be easy to imagine that life simply exists upon its surface. Forests grow across mountains and valleys. Animals move through oceans and skies. Plants spread across plains and deserts, adapting quietly to the conditions of the planet around them. But the deeper history of Earth reveals something far more remarkable. Life does not merely adapt to the world. It helps create it. From the earliest days of the planet's history, living organisms have been shaping the environment that surrounds them. Microbes altered the chemistry of ancient oceans. Early photosynthetic organisms released oxygen into the atmosphere, transforming a world once hostile to complex life. Over biological actions accumulated into planet change. The Carboniferous rainforests represent one of the clearest examples of this process. When those forests spread across the equatorial regions of the planet, they did far more than create horse. They faced from the atmosphere quitigen its place. We see gen levies, tuti distoskedi heights, credi hat shidehi, crede. The atmosphere itself changed, allowing giant insects to soar through the skies and shaping the ecosystems that flourished within those ancient wetlands. The forests were not just part of the environment, they were transforming it. Their roots stabilized soils. Their leaves influenced rainfall patterns. Their growth and decay altered the balance of gases circulating through the atmosphere. For millions of years, the Carboniferous forests acted as a planetary force. Yet even systems of such scale do not last forever. As climates shifted and continents moved across the surface of the Earth, the delicate balance supporting those forests began to weaken. Wetlands shrank. Rainfall patterns changed. The ecosystems that once seemed permanent gradually faded from dominance. But the disappearance of those forests did not end life's influence on the planet. Instead, it opened space for new biological systems to emerge. Seed plants spread across landscapes where ancient swamp vegetation could no longer thrive. Reptiles expanded into environments that amphibians struggled to inhabit. Ecosystems reorganized around the conditions of a more seasonal climate. Life adapted and continued to planet in new ways for continued patterns. Wyost, Werkliveres Weitiens influence, Solkeslowens, Hasselmeyer-mate. Across geological time, the same principle repeats itself again and again. Life fetes the earth those changes riskums. POT and ITC sheetem. New forms of life emerge within the environments created by earlier generations. The planet is not a passive stage where life simply performs. It is a system constantly rewritten by the organisms living upon it. Plants influence the atmosphere. Oceans regulate climate. Microorganisms transform minerals deep within the soil. Even the slow accumulation of plant remains beneath ancient swamps can reshape atmospheric chemistry for millions of years. The Carboniferous rainforest collapse reminds us that these interactions can operate across immense timescales. Forests spread across continents, altering the atmosphere in ways that influence the evolution of entire groups of organisms. When those forests vanished, the conditions they created continued shaping the path of life long afterward. The rise of reptiles, the later dominance of dinosaurs, and the eventual appearance of mammals all unfolded within the environmental framework those ancient ecosystems helped create. In this way, life and the planet are deeply intertwined. Each generation of organisms inherits a world shaped by those that came before. And as life continues evolving, it quietly rewrites the conditions of the Earth once again. Understanding this relationship invites a deeper reflection. If ecosystems can reshape the planet over millions of years, how many similar transformations might Earth have experienced across the vast expanse of its history? It might feel like a singular event, a strange chapter in the deep past of the planet. Yet when Tree is filled with words, Hitri is study the worlds that no longer exist. Study the Shodlivo record more closely. They decipher that the story of those is own one thread in. Long before the Carboniferous swamps spread across the continents, other ecosystems had already risen and vanished. Ancient seas once covered regions that are now deserts and mountain ranges. Coral reefs flourished in oceans that later disappeared. Forests grew in climates that no longer resemble anything on the modern Earth. Each era of the planet produced its own communities of life and its own delicate balance between atmosphere, oceans, and land. And each era eventually changed. Over billions of years, continents have drifted across the globe like enormous rafts of stone. They have collided to form mountain ranges taller than any alive today, only to erode slowly back into plains. Oceans have opened as continents pulled apart, then vanished again when landmasses returned to collide. The geography of the Earth has never remained fixed. Life has moved with these changes. Plants have colonized new continents. Animals have adapted to unfamiliar environments, and entire ecosystems have emerged in places where earlier life could never survive. Some fall gradually, spreading across downs. They happened with Schied, Schriegau, Viris, Frigi Forest, Vidalkauft, Rigau Squidi, Seed, Vigau Fico, Frigau Dugant. For a long span of geological time, they dominated the equatorial regions of the planet. Their dense vegetation shaped the atmosphere, supported strange and remarkable animals, and left behind the coal deposits that would one day influence human history. Yet, if we look at the Earth today, almost nothing of those forests remains visible on the surface. The swamps have disappeared. The giant insects are gone. The towering plants that once filled those wetlands exist only as fossils pressed into stone. Without the clues preserved in coal seams and ancient sediments, we might never know those forests existed at all. This is what makes the geological record so extraordinary. Beneath the landscapes we see today lies a layered archive of vanished worlds. Each layer of rock carries fragments of earlier environments, fossilized leaves, microscopic pollen, shells from long-extinct oceans, and chemical signatures that reveal the atmosphere of distant ages. Scientists studying these layers are In a sense, reading chapters from a book written across billions of years. And the deeper they look, the more chapters they discover. New technologies allow researchers to analyze tiny details within rocks and fossils, revealing patterns that were once invisible, subtle shifts in climate, forgotten ecosystems, and ancient environmental transformations continue emerging from the geological record. Each discovery reminds us that the world we know today is only a brief moment within a much longer story. Forests, oceans, and climates that appear permanent from a human perspective may represent only temporary arrangements in the ongoing evolution of the planet. The Carboniferous Rainforest collapse is one example of how dramatically the Earth can change. A vast ecosystem once spread across continents shaped the atmosphere and supported forms of life that seem almost mythical today. Then, over immense spans of time, that world faded and another took its place. And this pattern has repeated many times throughout Earth's history. Entire chapters of the planet's story remain hidden beneath layers of rock, waiting to be discovered. The landscapes we see today may one day become another forgotten layer within that archive. When years change is not the exception, it is the planet itself. We'd fast deep past. We'd find alien years ago. The Earth forwards, today's story returns once more to the planned, pitched frosty past. More than 300 million years ago, the Earth was covered by forests, ecoregions, wetlands that eye could see. Across swampy ground, there ranks straight and massive their crowns, forming endless grain canopies above dark waters and convoludes. Giant insects moved through the sky. Amphibians ruled the marshes below. For millions this world flourished. The Carboniferous rainforests shaped the atmosphere itself. Through the quiet process of photosynthesis, their immense vegetation absorbed enormous quantities of carbon dioxide while releasing oxygen into the air. The chemistry of the planet changed as those forests expanded across the continents. They created ecosystems so unusual that many of their inhabitants seem almost mythical today. And yet, despite their scale and influence, those forests did not last forever. As continents slowly drifted and climates shifted, the delicate balance that sustained the wetlands began to weaken. Rainfall patterns changed. Soils that had remained saturated for ages began drying in cycles. The endless rainforest fractured into smaller regions, separated by expanding plains and rivers. Over time, the forests faded. What had once been a nearly continuous ecosystem stretching across continents became scattered fragments of vegetation struggling to survive in a changing world. From the perspective of geological time, the transformation happened almost quietly, but the consequences were enormous. As the rainforests disappeared, the structure of life on land began to change. Amphibians that had thrived in the wetlands lost their dominance as dry landscapes spread. Reptiles, equipped with eggs that could develop away from water, began expanding into the emerging environments. Evolution accelerated, new plants adapted to seasonal climates. New predators and herbivores appeared across open landscapes. The ancient balance of the Carboniferous world gave way to ecosystems that would eventually define the Permian period and the ages that followed. From those changes would eventually emerge the great reptilian dynasties of later eras, including the dinosaurs. Much later still, mammals would evolve, diversify, and give rise to creatures capable of studying the planet's ancient past. Humans. The collapse of the Carboniferous rainforests was not simply the end of an ecosystem. It was a turning point in the story of life. Yet, even after the forests vanished from the surface of the Earth, their influence did not disappear. Beneath layers of sediment, the remains of those ancient plants slowly transformed into coal. For hundreds of millions of years, that buried carbon remained hidden underground. When humans eventually discovered those deposits, they unknowingly tapped into energy captured by prehistoric forests. Coal-powered steam engines, factories and railroads. It helped drive the Industrial Revolution and fueled the expansion of modern civilization. The sunlight, captured by carboniferous plants, long before dinosaurs existed, began powering the machines of the human world. In this unexpected way, the vanished forests continued shaping the future. What began as a prehistoric ecological transformation became part of the foundation of modern society. The story of the Carboniferous rainforest collapse therefore reaches far beyond ancient swamps and strange creatures of the distant past. It reveals how deeply interconnected life, climate, and planetary systems truly are. Ecosystems rise and flourish. They shape the atmosphere, influence evolution, and leave traces that endure long after they disappear. Beneath modern landscapes, beneath cities, forests, and fields, lie the silent remains of worlds that once seemed eternal. The Carboniferous forests are one of those forgotten worlds. They changed the atmosphere. They shaped the path of evolution. They left behind the energy that would one day power human civilization. And in their quiet disappearance, they help shape the world we inhabit today. A forest that vanished 300 million years ago still echoes through the history of the Earth. Its roots lie buried beneath our feet. And within those ancient roots, the long story of our own world quietly began.